Well, let me begin by thanking the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Serbia. I'm originally from the Caribbean, the tiny island of Antigua. And so when I told, some of my friends, oh, I have to go to Serbia, they go, Serbia? What are you going to be doing in Serbia, right? So really, it's a pleasure to be here. And this paper is dedicated to Natalija because it is Natalija who introduced me to János Varoufakis's book, The Global Minotaur. And the title of my paper is Xenophobia and the Decline of the Global Minotaur. All right, so let me get started. The political history of the United States, and this is really a focus on American capitalism, right? And the relationship between American capitalism and xenophobia. One way in which we can look at the political history of the United States is to look at it in terms of these periodic outbreaks of conservative xenophobic thinking and politicking, right? There have been many of them, but at the core of them is always a perceived threat, along with vast claims, ridiculous claims of some kind of global conspiracy, usually international, combining local and international conspirators to destroy the American way of life. Now, from these cases and some of the references made in the talks today, we can define xenophobia as a deep-rooted, fear-driven project of excluding groups who are perceived as different and at the same time somehow threatening. Since 1980, the United States has entered into another of these periods of far-right, paranoid, xenophobic politics, right? And this particular turn has unleashed increasing levels of anti-Muslim, anti-Black, and anti-Mexican racism, right? That this has been the distinctive feature of this particular episode of outbreaks. So before I get into the contemporary one, just let me run through quickly some earlier episodes. The historian Larry Tees and Richard Hofstadter have identified some of the earliest examples of American xenophobia. And these earliest examples have been the response of Euro-Americans to the slaves that they were importing from Africa. That we have this peculiar ambivalence. White Americans wanted the labor of Africans, but not the human presence of Africans that were racialized as Black, right? These people were Negroes and at worst, niggers, right? But at the same time, you were importing them because you wanted their labor. At the same time, you don't want them in the country. So for example, in his notes on the state of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson declared that Africans were unassimilable into the United States. They were a polluting element that would destroy the very fabric of the country. And hence he supported the work of the American Colonization Society. In fact, he served as president of the American Colonization Society. And this society, of course, was dedicated to returning freed Africans back to Africa, and in particular, to the American colony of Liberia, which was created for this purpose of getting Africans who were not slaves out of the country, right? So this is a classic example of xenophobia, right? And xenophobia against peoples of African descent. And in this ambivalence towards African labor, I think we have a template for the ambivalence that we will see in relation to other forms of immigrant labor, whether it be Mexicans, you know, whatever. It's going to be this, we want your labor, but we don't want you to stay. Now, if we leave this initial episode against peoples of African descent, and this period of xenophobic response to Africans, it begins very early, starting around 1630. We have documents about it. And periodically, it goes right up until the Civil War, right? That's where we see a shift in attitudes towards African Americans. Now, the second outbreak of xenophobia that I want to draw your attention to is the famous French/Illuminati outbreak, right? This is so comical, right? Because in the 1790s, it's just like literally a decade and a half after the revolution, America is gripped, you know, by this fear, right? And this fear, right, is being fed constantly by references to some Bavarian Illuminati who is organizing this conspiracy to support the French Revolution and at the same time subvert federal rule in the US. This leads to an episode that I wish I had time to share with you, because the key person involved in both of these outbreaks, right, was Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale. And to me, he is the father of American conservatism. If you want to see the first large systematic outline of conservative American thought, I think it's the thought of Timothy Dwight, right? All of the people of the Enlightenment that he once celebrated became infidels. And he wrote this book called The Triumph of Infidelity. And he wrote a special book for incoming students at Yale on the nature and danger of infidel philosophy. And it is all of the rationalist and Enlightenment philosophers that he had turned into what he called infidels. And they became this great threat to American society. So at one point, Dwight was very much opposed to slavery, but then he turned around and became a supporter of slavery, because to end slavery he saw as this disruption of the order of American society. It was a threat to the order of American society to try and end slavery, right? So it's just the power of it, you know? That, to me, that is so striking here. All right. Next episode, the rise of apartheid in the American South, right? The rise of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, you know, extreme terrorist violence, right? And of course, this is part of the backlash in response to the outcome of the Civil War, the ending of slavery, et cetera, et cetera. And this pattern we're going to see, that you have a progressive period, and then there is this counter-reaction, right? Very common. And so we can look at the apartheid in the South as another extreme outbreak of anti-black xenophobic violence. And then, of course, I think the most famous of all, the periods of conspiracy in American history, is, of course, the communist conspiracy, of the 1950s, which peaked with Senator Joseph McCarthy, right? And McCarthy firmly believed that starting with the New Deal policies of the Roosevelt administration, right, that this was the birth of an international communist conspiracy to end American capitalism, right? And he included President Eisenhower, of all people. I mean, you know, such a clean, middle-of-the-road, central Republican. McCarthy was convinced that he was part of this international conspiracy to hand over American capitalism to the communists. Secretary of State George Marshall, hero of the war and father of the Marshall Plan, all of that. He was part of the conspiracy also. Arthur Burns. Burns was, of course, Secretary of the Treasury. All of these people. Judges on the Supreme Court, you know, all of these people, right? It was a huge conspiracy. Einstein, Harry Belafonte, all of these people were involved in this conspiracy to turn America over to the communists. I think that is, for me, the quintessential example, right, of this paranoid style in American politics. All right. So having illustrated what I'm talking about, let me now turn to the current outbreak. And again, we'll see this exaggerated element of paranoia matched with this ability to externalize internal problems. Now, for me, the current outbreak has been determined by, and to me, is a counter response to the progressive movements of the 1960s and 70s. Just as the rise of apartheid and the Ku Klux Klan was a response to the outcome of the Civil War and the end of slavery, I see something similar here in the rise of this particular movement. In the 60s, we had the African-American Civil Rights Movement. We had the women's movement, student movement, right? And these were all movements that changed fundamentally the gender, the academic, and the racial norms of American society. And I think in particular of the policy of affirmative action, right? That one of the major outcomes of the civil rights movement was policies of affirmative action. And I would argue that one of the major triggers of this conservative turn has been affirmative action. There's a determined effort to counter that. And I think the historical documentation is there that really, really points to this fact. I don't have time to go into that today. Now, in addition to the normative changes introduced by these three movements, this rightward turn in the US in the 1980s was also in response to a number of significant economic problems that were appearing in the case of the American economy. Most important of these was that in 1971, the United States had to go off the gold standard. Huh? And so that the US dollar was no longer backed by gold. Right? Following this change, what we get, of course, is a dramatic rise in the deficits and surpluses of countries, because the automatic equilibrating mechanism, right, that the gold standard had with it was no longer operative. Under the gold standard, you could not accumulate massive surpluses or massive deficits, right? That once you're on that standard, if your trade was imbalanced, you had to rebalance it either by an inflow or an outflow of gold, right? This is what breaks down in 1971. And so a lot of countries begin accumulating massive deficits and massive debts. As a matter of fact, it is during this period that the United States moved from being the surplus creditor economy to probably the biggest now, deficit debtor country. So the removal of the gold standard is a crucial event here. Right? Further complicating this economic picture is the fact that the United States also had a stagflation crisis starting around 1972, 74, somewhere around there. And it's going to continue until Volcker is called in, and he's going to have to stamp out inflation and all of that, right? So in short, by the late 70s, mid to late 70s, the US economy is staggering. Right? It is very unsteady. And it is this unsteadiness, right, that is going to give rise to what Varoufakis will call the Global Minotaur, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful metaphor for understanding, especially in layman's terms. If you're not an economist, really helps you to understand what's going on with the US economy. Now, of course, the Global Minotaur is a reference to the mythic bull of King Minos of Crete. And this bull is half bull, half human, and therefore has to devour human flesh. Mean guy, you know, but smart. He's half human, half bull. Now, in the American case, the Minotaur, right, is not going to devour human flesh, but billions of dollars, right? It's going to be, you know, just consuming billions of dollars. This ravish consumption of dollars derived from the US decision that it could profit from its deficits, that the appropriate response to these deficits was to increase them and profit from them rather than reduce them or eliminate them the way it would have had to if the gold standard was still operative. The decision to profit from its rising deficits, the current account deficit and the trade deficit, derived from the fact that the US dollar remained the major trading currency in spite of the fact that it was no longer backed by gold, right? So here's what this did for the US. Trade deficits, right, with surplus countries like Japan, Germany, South Korea, all of these countries, right? These trade deficits with surplus countries would no longer be settled by outflows of gold. They simply could be settled by outflows of dollars, right? So, and a lot of these dollars were just printed dollars, nothing behind them, but the reputation of the federal government, right? What a way to solve your deficits, you know, right? Simply because the world accepts your money, right? You have this out that no other country had, right? And so this is the sense in which Varoufakis is saying this is a Minotaur, right? That, you know, geez, I got this deficit, but because my money, right, is the king of monies, I can just print it and give it to my debt to my creditors, and they'll take it. This is a gift, right? This is the easiest way possible to solve your economic difficulties, right? Now, once the U.S. gave all of this cash to countries to cover the deficit, you see, it did this knowing that the recycling of these dollars right, was going to be a problem for these countries. If they took these dollars and just placed them in the bank, you're going to get inflation, right? And of course, nobody wants inflation. So what do they do with these dollars? They send them back to Wall Street, right? And they would either invest in American stocks, bonds, etc., or they would actually do direct investments in the US. So the money came right back to the US because most of these countries could not afford to just put it into the banking systems, right? It would just totally overload the banking systems, right? Create inflation and ruin the economy. So you had this circular process, right, around the deficit. And it gave the United States every incentive to increase these deficits rather than decrease them, right? Because the bigger the deficits, the more money you made on them. It was really a case of profiting off of your deficits, right? Okay, so United States was having great fun, right? I can't remember who it was, but anyway, you know, one of these many ambassadors for the U.S., when the U.S. went off the gold standard, they said to them, it's your problem, right? It's your problem. And this is exactly what he was talking about. Anyway, this continues, of course, and it's just having great fun, right up until the financial meltdown of 2008, right? With financial markets in turmoil, banks in distress, the circular flow of money which fed the Minotaur was thoroughly disrupted, right? That system, right, of regulating trade, because trade relations have to be balanced in some way, right? Other than that, people are going to stop trading. You're going to feel as though you're ripping me off, right? So the central banks, right, took control of all of the capitalist economies, violating all the rules of capitalism, right? Policies like quantitative easing, the government deciding on interest rates, right? So that in the United States, interest rates was zero, right? So that if you were a saver, right, for about 9 years, you got no interest on your money, right? All in an effort to help the banks. So the central banks were really in charge of the European economies and the American economy. If I'm not mistaken, I think that the EU is still doing quantitative easing, right? And quantitative easing, you know, the bank actually purchases, you know, stuff like that. So with the central banks in charge, right, the Global Minotaur is out, right? So Minotaur is out. Then what we get is, at least in the case of the US, is after three rounds of quantitative easing, is that the US economy is pulled back from the brink, right? So you're back from the brink now, and so the question is, what are you going to do? What is going to be the way forward? And what is interesting about the direction that the US economy has taken and the reactions to it since 2008, it has turned the conservative movement even further to the right. Right? What do I mean by that? That one of the consequences of the 2008 crisis was the rise of the Tea Party. Right? And this is going to be a party that's going to form within the Republican Party. The Tea Party was triggered by a 2009 very angry response by a television reporter, his name was Rick Santelli, to Obama's decision to include mortgage relief in his package to rescue the economy, right? You know, he created this huge package. Some banks were nationalized, some were subsidized, some were recapitalized. And then he decided to include help for those individuals, right, who were paying mortgages on homes who had lost more than half their value. Well, somebody on the far right had a big problem with this. And this was Mr. Rick Santelli. He's a television announcer, and he accused Obama of subsidizing the losers, right? And he said, we must form a Tea Party here in Chicago, this is where he was broadcasting from, to fight this decision. And bingo, that is exactly what happened, right? After that broadcast, the Tea Party movement just came into being and mushroomed, right? And all of this talk going right back to we must get rid of the New Deal. They saw, you know, Obama's action, right, as though there was no separation between it and the New Deal. So the whole goal of the Tea Party was to return America to the time before the New Deal. So again, as Lewis was saying, in conservative thinking, you always have this backward glance, right, to some golden age or some period that was better. And so the goal here was to do away with the welfare state, you know, Medicare, Medicaid, all of this stuff. And then Obama was going to introduce what came to be known as Obamacare, and all of this. This was seen as the ultimate fulfillment of the New Deal. And this is what the Tea Party, right, made it its mission to fight. And so within the Republican Party, they began to organize, and soon we had Tea Party candidates replacing the mainstream Republican candidates, right? Okay, and we know that out of this rightward turn, Trump became a candidate for the Republicans, and in that way became president of the United States. Now, what has happened and what is Trump doing? To me, Trump has turned himself into a symbol both of white supremacy and of a symbol of an economic hero. Right? He makes these racist statements on public platforms of a type that we've not seen since the presidency of the runnings of George Wallace. The open attack on Mexicans. These are criminals and drug dealers. We're going to build a wall to keep them out, and then we're going to make Mexico pay for it. This, to me, was a symbol upon which all of these white conservatives could hang their hats very publicly, right? The birther movement, right? Trump was the leader of the birther movement, this movement that Obama was not born in America, and that he was not a Christian, but a Muslim. He knew this was a lie, but for months, years, he kept hammering away at it. And it appealed to a lot of white conservatives, giving them, right, this symbol that they could hang all of their racial fears on. At the same time that he made himself into this white supremacist symbol, he also made himself into an economic symbol, right? Kind of an economic hero, right? That, again, conservatives could hang their anxieties about America becoming the fulfillment of the New Deal on, right? And so when we look at what he's done, first, to me, he's doing fundamentally just two things. One, he's trying to restore America's industrial capacity And he's trying to now take care of the surplus equilibrating problems that were left unsolved with the decline of the global Minotaur. So he's going to impose tariffs on Europe, China, all this stuff, right? Then he's going to, right, just muscle countries into renegotiating all of these trade deals. Unilaterally leaves the TPP. He's now renegotiated NAFTA, minor changes, right? And he's made Peter Navarro his chief advisor on trade. And if you want to know who Peter Navarro is, read his book, Death by China, right? It is the most paranoid form of economic analysis that you would want to see. So, to me, there's a paranoid element in Trump that it's different from the Tea Party, but in another way, it is continuing it. So, I'll leave it right there.
False hope of transnationalism. In the present state of world affairs, problems ranging from political, climatic, environmental, and economic to those of human rights infringements and biological and social diversity are often seen as solvable through expert handling and mediated negotiations. The virtues of old-fashioned internationalism, like one of Communist International, are dissolved in particularism, corporate-style management, and identity politics. It is important to distinguish the hope that is inherent in the vision of international solidarity, sometimes still glimpsed in the event of a global catastrophe, solidarity and humanist ideals best represented in the spontaneous protests, sometimes reaching global attention, and the international community, so-called, residing in transnational organizations which are keeping their importance in play through negotiations where they factor in with their particular interests. We are thinking of transnationalism as a tendency to delegate local, national, and regional problems to transnational bodies and extolling their virtues as unquestionably unbiased, rational, expert-informed, consensual, creating a system informed by Habermasian communication. In order to truly understand why transnational organizations are not performing their cohesive function better, we must look at the environment they are working in. The nature of capitalism is going to change most profoundly the advent of corporate multinational capitalism as the more dominant mode of socioeconomic exchanges than the traditional capitalism. The issues relevant to their change are innovations in technology, the change in the understanding of the relationship between representative and participatory democracy, and the understanding of economic equality and economic justice. Innovations in technology are relevant because we cannot pretend that Bitcoin or a similar invention will not transform our financial transactions and the very understanding of the role of money in the economy. We can understand the nature of financial products for what they are, constructs in human exchange. In this profound change, concepts of capital and labor, essential for study of capitalism, are transformed. Representative democracy is falling short of fulfilling the promises it made, that we all have a say in decision-making and the decisions made will be for the best. As Thomas Piketty says in the conclusion of his monumental work on the economic controversies surrounding inequality capital in the 21st century, dynamic development of market economy and private property, left to itself, leads to powerful convergence, especially connected to development of knowledge and skill, but it also leads to divergence, potentially threatening our democratic societies and values of social justice they are founded on. Participation of citizens in democratic processes linked to informed decision-making and not only in election of representatives. Participative democracy and not only representative democracy is essential for quality citizenship. It contributes to real wealth based not only on GDP but also on Human Development Index. There used to be international movements based on universal values which were expressed through shared interests. But international community, or order as it is sometimes called, is ruled by geopolitical dynamic of states in power play and is ostensibly mediated through transnational organizations like World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, European Union, OPEC, OSCE, Council of Europe, UN with all its incredibly corrupt agencies, UNESCO, UNDP, UNICEF, UN Women, UN FDPA, UNHCR, NATO, international courts, etc. Transnational organizations, due to power play between nations, corporate nature of their functioning, and lack of sincerity about their upholding universal values, didn't deliver internationalism in the sense of non-nationalism in dealings between nations. Competition outweighs cooperation, something transnationalism was supposed to foster. How did transnational institutions develop their corporate nature? Once upon a time, after the hidden collapse of the post-Second World War financial and economic order in the 70s, it's been explained, so I know we have to talk about it, the managerial style became corporate, which means that the focus of economic activity didn't include widespread prosperity, but narrowed to serving the profit beneficiaries. That wasn't essentially new, but the style that accommodated disregard for the actual national interests in, say, destroying food sovereignty, like here, was the consequence of alienation between national, that is, political power, and economic power. Therefore, political power became just a tool in increasing economic power, influence being traded as commodity. Obviously, these are not inventions of that era, but their dominance is specific for the particular technological and bureaucratic development. Going back to nationalism is a way to confirm values, national, religious, traditional, for the lack of any universal ones, widely recognized, and fulfill interests, national, class, or any particular interest group. Global protest in the spirit of true internationalism is in part impossible because of all the bits of incomplete, contradictory information floating around, which makes little drops of protest less likely to coalesce, as well as the modern way of life, which seems like a waste of life on administration and entertainment. That way of life that requires constant vigilance against predators and distraction from drinking cannot truly be called progress. Protest of any kind develop from a feeling of resistance to injustice grounded in natural understanding, according to Hume in Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. For example, that kind of understanding of injustice. Global protest didn't develop because there is always the promise of a better life if you only can make it to Sweden. And because the fifth rider of the apocalypse is stupidity, there is no understanding of commonalities that transcend the narrow nationalistic interests. Fragmentation of resistance is also the result of fragmentation of shared values and interests, where there doesn't seem to be an understanding that there is no true personal interest if, by virtue of loss of values, the integrity of the person is lost, but different groupings of interest groups and identity groups with little overlap make it impossible to make a coherent plea for justice. There may be an impression that something on that path is gained, for instance in Me Too campaign, but that is the confusion of PR campaign that doesn't in itself bring justice or societal change, that collapses with different identifications with other groups, as in women who sided with Trump and or Kavanaugh. The political choices, with politics reduced to a segment of PR industry, remain divorced from any core values and interests. The diversification of political groups, according to perceived interests and values, makes for the lack of any common ground, making difficulties for compassion to play a role with the lack of universal understanding. Corporate structure encompassing transnational organizations, on the other hand, makes for actions that ignore particular interests in pursuit of organizations' goals. In a way, it's an old argument that social discontent breeds fascism, but it is always played out a little differently. This wave of new right-wing, intolerant authoritarianism is a product of global society undergoing rapid change due to enhanced interconnectedness. It is different in appearance from the classic totalitarianism because of the changing way propaganda is disseminated and the speed of change in the economy due to technological advancement in production and trade. Transnationalism is at the center of it because its role changed from a regulatory interstate negotiating tool to imposition of models of distribution and enforcement that are centralized in cult-type interest groups. Now, this is important. So now, transnational organizations, they don't really mediate nations. National interests, still blamed in the PR campaign for allowing corporate interests to invade the earth, are misrepresented and hollowed out as if the sustained peace and prosperity are outranked by dominance and aggressive accumulation of wealth. I'll have to quote Varoufakis too. This is newer stuff from Global Minotaur. Meanwhile, independently of establishment politicians' aims and their ideological smoke screens, capitalism has been evolving. The vast majority of economic decisions have long ceased to be shaped by market forces and are now taken within a strictly hierarchical, though fairly loose, hyper-cartel of global corporations. Its managers fix prices, determine quantities, manage expectations, manufacture desires, and collude with politicians to fashion pseudo-markets to subsidize their services. The first casualty was the New Deal era aim of full employment, which was duly replaced by an obsession with growth. The result is not only unnecessary hardship for vast segments of humanity, it also heralds a global doom loop of deepening inequality and chronic instability. The role of transnational organizations in the cartelization of global economy and its dominance over all other aspects of life world is their integration of proposed standards, as you can see in Kostas Ouzina's work, into the system in such a way that the products of transnational organizations, and their products are treaties, recommendations, development projects, are incorporated into the dominance of the cartel managing delivery of all resources and their outputs to the global economy dominated by the increasingly financialized cartel. The values inherent in internationalism are reinterpreted as outputs of projects, dominance, and unsustainable development. New forms of nationalism, xenophobia, and national identity are manipulated as replacements for, let's say, professional and class identity. In so-called culture wars, two kinds of identities are emphasized: racial, national, ethnic, regional, and tribal, and sexual, political, and cultural, as opposed to class and or professional identity that corresponds to interest, and that is why in political culture there is even more irrationality than before, because the interests of the voters are not in play, only their feelings of belonging. The need to belong is strong. In the absence of groups that can express authentic needs, the identification with national, ethnic, racial, sexual, and cultural history is played as the only card. There is growing evidence that inequality brings about instability. Inequality, reaching new heights and distinction in scary outcomes for future generations, is going to be exercised in a prenatal level. The technology for that already exists. We may not be aware if it is even in use. Although it is amply shown in serious research that the economic conditions relate to the early prospects at a substantial rate, one of the basic tenets of the prevailing neoliberal ideology is that merit is the major generator of education, income, and general success. That makes it less appealing to foster cooperation instead of competition. Institutions and communities depend on cooperation to develop in a meaningful way. They cannot be sustained through hierarchy and competition alone. And then the need to belong is expressed through different kinds of exaggerated group identities. Frustrations present in large segments of populations are sometimes expressed through extreme nationalism, where the mere presence of others, women, refugees, migrants, other races, other sexualities, and people simply from the other side of the tracks is seen as an unfair, notion of fairness being always suspect to me anyway, threat that has to be addressed by more cohesion in the group mobilized against threatening others. What do they threaten? Something that rightfully belongs to us, our commons. This displacement makes it even less likely to see that the commons are disappearing in the narrowing top 1% of owners of financial, real and ghost money alike, natural, land, water, ore, and social, technology, healthcare, education resources. And some of it is from Michael Ignatieff. The loss of commons is the loss of the ideal of humanity, without which belonging reverts to group identified by race, gender, and of course nation. Without redistribution existent even in malign systems like feudalism, for example, it is impossible to sustain motivation for output-driven economy, and without a somewhat free market, it is impossible to even out, iron out, or just tame the worst dysfunctionalities of post-capitalism. Horizontal and vertical inequality with the parody of merit system, like assigning merit to bankers, is detrimental to economy, life world, and descent, or even their existence of large number of people, making them dispensable. See Piketty. It also gets rid of democratic adjustment in the political realm, see Stiglitz, making for no agent for global concerns. Examples: disintegration of European Union, the lingering of 2008 crisis, disintegration of political institutions, and general regression of United States. Growing grassroots alt-right and mass populist low-right movements attest to disoriented rage towards the faceless acronyms like International Monetary Fund, IMF, deciding on millions of individual destinies. The hope in internationalism as the bright future of humanity is hijacked to a collection of phrases at worst and humiliating humanitarian aid at best. Nationalism's strongest divisive properties are needed to feed both the inequality and instability. It provides for enemies within and without to allow for the call for sacrifices needed to overcome the danger, to punish the lazy, and to exclude the people who could possibly coexist with us in solidarity. Austerity is the price we pay for permissiveness in allowing others, poor, manual workers, servants, darker-skinned people, females, homosexuals, artsy, bookish, or simply different people, to share in the commons of our own device, to infringe on our birthright, to play the capitalist game for which they're not equipped by legacy, temperament, and our understanding of fair play as played by gentlemen. The commons must be defended, our land must remain Christian, Muslim, patriarchal, white, straight, traditional. Our recognition of our value as individuals and as a community, what Americans call exceptionalism, is embedded in sharing in the spoils. So commons exist, but are not just for anybody. Feelings of entitlement sometimes make a confusion of rights and privileges. Speaking of rights, they can be universal, like human rights. They can belong to a certain community, like civil rights, or be the result of merit. The notion that really is at risk is merit. It can come from labor, property, influence. Speaking of universal income, like the embodiment of social rights that European institutions often praised, and this is Council of Europe's social charter, it is the extension of welfare and exclusion from the labor force. This is the idea that is talked about in Europe and experimented with of giving universal income, not as a social benefit, but simply to everyone. But this is actually exclusion of welfare and exclusion from the labor force of certain parts of the population needed with the lessened need for workers. Lauded as practically a communist idea in its generosity and inclusion, it is actually a fraction of the cost of unemployment and unrest and keeps the streets clean, but depending on its implementation can have consequences similar to multi-generational welfare. The current disintegration of cosmopolitan political agenda, regression in understanding of the nature of growth, sustainable is not even mentioned lately, the change in the concept of future, the change in the power play between generations, the global superpower exchange and the global challenges, as much for the existence, also for the soul of humanity, are going to be met by catastrophic solutions due to the lack of any other checks on the powers to be. Our rethinking development, the true understanding of sustainability is impossible if we keep all matters of international relations, financial transactions, trade rules and commercial practices secret as private deals between powerful wise leaders and complicated expertise of consultants. Ideological thinking, blind market faith, belt tightening, and money fetishism are ruinous. Instead, we can value people, nature, resources and history, future and knowledge above mesmerizing numbers of commas in bank accounts. There is a global trend of alienation of expert culture, especially in the financial sphere, from general socioeconomic mainstream, and the concept of a collective, which is one that is in the core of its meaning, under attack of social policy that diminishes its content by substituting that with something implicitly dependent on the notion of natural right. We will need all the strength of our minds and imaginations to resist the urge to follow spiraling toxic financial takeover of natural, economic, human, and social resources, and it will hit us hard and fast. As productive participants in the economy, laborers, consumers, and such, we should not ascribe value to vacuous and dangerous speculations, since labor is an intrinsic part of value, and as citizens, we should not acquiesce in manufacturing of consent, lest there remains nothing of value to consent to. As productive participants in the, I copied it twice. We should be wary not so much of Greeks as of international monetary fund bearing gifts, which dismantles public sector, demands sale of public assets, and shrinking of institutions most of third world countries never recovered from. Disaster is not in our wallets as much as our minds. As feminists claim that personal is political, it is clear that financial is not mathematical, it is political. The disintegration of any faith in spirituality, science, art, and democracy, justice, and opportunity make people search for magical fix or shred of hope. Generational gap between baby boomer parents, co-conspirators of greed and privilege who still admit no wrong, and their millennial or whatever offspring who are given no hope, and doomsday clocks of all kinds are looming over their heads, is heightened by the illusion that there ever was a better future. The lack of sheer understanding of what might be in common for different sexes, generations, classes, and nations is fueling the divisions that are becoming dangerous. And I'll let Edward Said finish, if only because far from being at the end of history, we are in position to do something about our own present and future history, whether we live inside or outside of the metropolitan world.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Natalija Mićunović. Thank you very much for inviting. And I love to be here. And I love very much Serbia and also Croatia and Slovenia. I am always very glad to come in these countries. I told just by the lunch that I am such a Central European that my mother is Hungarian, my father is German, but my mother, who is Hungarian, the name of her is in Hungarian Horvat, that means Croatian. So it's okay. Ethics and Identity is the title, and just the subtitle, Proposition for a New Cognitive Political Order on the Basis of Kant, Rorty, Ros, and Vlaisavljević. And there is no Derrida. Originally it was Derrida, but Derrida was too complicated for me now to involve. I have written down my presentation, so if someone would like to have, I can give it to you after the, thank you very much, after the lecture. You see here also I wrote all possibility of my name. Brambauer, after Boros, it was our original German name. Before my birth, it was changed to Boros by my grandfather, and I come from a city which has at least 3 or 5, 6 names. I don't know whether I wrote correctly Pecsú. It is.
Yes,
it is.
Ah,
okay. So it is. Thank you, and I start. How can I continue? If I push the this, just go here, this or this. Okay. I see. Okay. Good. You can just crawl. This. And how can I go back? At this.
With the Arabs. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Good. Okay. So here you see the summary of my presentation, but I cannot speak about all this. I try to build up an argument how xenophobia could be overcome by a new kind of social and individual identity definition which is based on ethics. I think there are some historical examples what I will mention. Okay, first I will read the introductory part, and then I will more rely on the presentation, on the paper presentation. The rise of xenophobic national identitarian movements in Europe and elsewhere cannot be the right answer to the political, economic, communicative, ethical challenges of our time. It is, however, probable that they are reactions to real problems which bother large segments of the population. We should consider that there are no borders of communication, there cannot or should not function borders for cultural, economic, or politically isolated communities. The concept of identity is debated by philosophers. Without identity, without saying who we are, what we are doing and why, a person or communities of people cannot exist. You have your personal name, your family, your friends, and you tell stories about yourself. You have a narrative identity in the community of people and in the community of nations, and the name of identity represents you. It mediates what you are, who you are. You identify yourself as Serbian, as German, as professor or soldier. If you have one identity, you cannot have in the same sense another identity. If you have a Serbian identity, you cannot have in the same sense also a German identity, although you can have two citizenship. In a precise sense, an identity means X is something and not something else. It is only possible if this something has clear boundary. Otherwise, we would not know where ends the identity and where begins the other. The personal identity proposed by philosophers has ethical foundation, and ethics is universal. Now, can a person, a country, have an identity which is based on universal principles? That means, can something be such that everything in that sense, all people or all countries can be identical with him, with her, or with it? A universal identity, if there is such a thing, is the identity of everyone. Can be reached such a kind of identity? I would like to propose an ethical model of identity based on, especially on the theory of Kant and Rawls. In my investigation, I would like to analyze also the theory of identity of Ugo Vlaisavljević. Ethical identity should help to preserve particular national identities without animosity and exclusivity. Before starting, we should take into consideration that all human identities are evolving in time. That means in history. Identity is always happening or is produced in historical time. Perhaps history is an identity-building machine of people and for people. Thus, history has still a sense in our age. Can we still speak about history in our time? The problem is that history does not exist as such, as an sich, as so a man. It is a construction. So, history constructs identity, and who constructs history? A constructed entity constructs another constructed entity. History constructs personal and communal societal identity. As it is known, history, and now I speak a little bit about society. You will see why society is contemporary history. As it is known, the French sociologist Bruno Latour has the thesis that there is no such thing as society, at least as substance. It is no longer clear whether there exists a relation that there are specific enough to be called social, and that could be grouped together in making up a special domain that could function as a society. It was a quotation from Latour. For him, there is only the chaotic, communicative, linguistic, psychological, economic, emotive interchange of people who establishes and dissolves continuously, without pause, and all connections between humans. And this can be said about history also, since history is society in time. History constructs societies in an ontological sense, and societies construct histories in an epistemological sense. If there is no such substance as society, there cannot be such substance as history either. What remains, following Latour, is the network of people, and perhaps this can be a chance for the societies in Europe, and especially in Eastern Europe. In the following, let us suppose that although there is no such substance as history, but there are the words history, society, identity, and these are words, concepts with which we can do certain work about in our communities. They do not denote any substance, that means they do not exist in an ontological sense, hence they are changeable for the best or for the worst. So society can be changed, and we can ameliorate this, and I hope that I will arrive to the point when I can show very briefly what is the way of this. The personal use of words with epistemological but with limited ontological relevance is also the question of ethics. The societal use of words with epistemological but with limited ontological relevance is a question of cultural politics. And I come now to this question. In democracy, politics has to be based on ethics, and of course cultural, and how it is, of course, a long discutable question. And of course, cultural politics in democracy is based on ethics. Hence, the use of words about non-existence or with limited existence is a question of ethically based cultural politics. Richard Rorty defines so. The quotation: the term cultural politics covers, among other things, arguments about what words to use. Rorty means cultural politics originates from Hegel and Dewey. Rorty holds the main task of philosophy to contribute to humanity's ongoing conversation about what to do with itself. He represents and proposes the pragmatist maxim that what makes no difference to practice should make no difference in philosophy. That means to our thinking. Philosophy, as Dewey says it, is not in any sense whatever a form of knowledge. It is a social hope reduced to a working program of action, a prophecy of the future. Following Dewey, Rorty interprets then one of the best understanding of today's philosophy, which is, philosophy is, you can see, philosophy is best seen as a series of efforts to modify people's sense of who they are, what matters to them, what is most important, end of quotation. If we base the build-up or the construction of our communal structures of our living together on justice, responsibility, and freedom in a modern sense, then we have to ask what matters, what is important, and we have to reinterpret all older concepts, identity, ethics, philosophy, politics, society. Let us continue with some remarks on history. And now I stop reading because then I won't come to an end, and just have a look what I have here on the PP. And I discuss here very shortly Fukuyama's idea at the end of history, after I have questioned whether there exists such a thing as a history. And I analyzed that Fukuyama is right in a historic sense, and right in a conceptual sense, and wrong in a conceptual sense, and wrong in a historic sense, all in different aspects. Why is he right in a historic sense? Because a kind of history came to an end with the end of the Cold War. That's a kind of history came to an end. I think one very important aspect, events in general and historical events especially are fundamentally struggles for justice, or put it another way, one of the main motivation of events in the society is the fight for justice. And I could argue for that eventually in the discussion. And I think that and now we have some American guests here. I am convinced that in the history with the American Constitution and Declaration of Independence and this kind of papers, one society in a form of a declaration or in a normative sense established a society with the possibility of social justice, with the procedural possibility of justice. And this is why so many people wanted to enter the United States in the last 200 years, but we can discuss it. Perhaps you have another idea about this. Okay. I think that we are at the end of the history also in a conceptual sense, when we think, for example, that in a philosophical sense we reach the end of history. And I quote Rorty, "My hunch is that Western social and political thought may have had the last conceptual revolution it needs." So conceptually, normatively, and also in a certain sense we are at the end of the history, but Fukuyama is also wrong in two senses. In historic sense, because we have seen history didn't come to an end, and in normative, conceptual sense also, because we see that there is a lot of work to do. So I mean, identity is a question of history, of society, and but all these concepts, when we say history, society, identity, all are questionable, and we have enormous difficulties when we go into the deep of these notions. And I have read a lot of papers preparing for this conference of Mr. Vlaisavljević, and even I found it so inspiring that I proposed to him that we make a conference about his papers in Hungary. There are a lot of ideas which are useful also for discussions, not only in Hungary, but I think in the European Union. And now what is the situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina? I quote There are three major Bosnian ethnic communities because at least three past empires had such a strong influence on the local population that the acculturation they exercised in the past has come to determine the fate of large numbers of people today. Each community has its own privileged imperial reference, italics from me, and simultaneously excludes the similar references of neighboring communities. They are different because the choice of constitutive imperial culture is not the same. What one Bosnian community sees as a very positive imperial influence and adopts as a crucial identity marker becomes a perilous negative influence to be rejected by the other two communities. Okay, and this is a very interesting part. Privileged imperial reference. This is the past. We can see from this text that the problem is that the past has control over the present, and all traditions, imperial past, have a strong influence in Bosnia. And I think this is what should be overcome. So against old-fashioned, pre-modern, imperial cultures or even religions, we have to find or construct new identities, new techniques of living together. So, of course, this is a very long way. I don't think that it can be done in a fast way. Okay, in the next, I think we agree all. Identity must not lead to fear or even hate. There are other possibilities in meeting the other people. And I quote again Mr. Vlaisavljević, ethnopolitics builds in time of war and identity, an identity which is defined against the enemy. Yes, and just if ethnopolitics needs war, then we don't need ethnopolitics because we don't want war. To forget the last war means that the community will lose forever its ethnic identity. If war and ethnic identity presuppose each other, then we have to question both. We all question the war. No one wants to have any more war, neither in this country nor in any other European countries. Of course, no peace without justice. So we have to make justice, we have to make a peace with justice and without war. This is, and that's why ethnic identity is strengthened very specifically by war, says Ugo Vlaisavljević, and here the responsibility of politicians is extraordinary, that they have to work on identities which are not based on war. Okay, why people is looking for communities, for local communities? Because local communities, where we are all living in local communities. What does a local community give us, which can end finally in ethnopolitics? It gives us community, human warmth, support, common language, organization of life, administration, political overview, discursive publicity, or neighborhood, unifying efforts. Local communities give us a lot, and we are looking for this, and of course, local communities fear universal political models. Why? Bad imperial experiences in the past, political centers are far away, no discursive communities, no representations of everyday interests, justice come off badly. Against this, we can say universal political model can function, justice for the locally living people, for each individual, can be realized. locally living people and individuals should experience and feel the ensured justice. So we have to construct a common ethical identity and in the meantime ensure also the feeling for the local people that they are living in their community and even they can live their own culture. And all this means economy must be free from politics. People can and should take responsibility for themselves. Economy is the responsibility, reliability, and seriousness of each individual. These are all aspects for which I should, and I could, or even I argued in the longer version of the paper. And Vlaisavljević writes, no ethnic community should overtake the public space. For that, the civic deal, which is in a multi-ethnic milieu, always potential a deal between ethnics, is really reciprocal and fair. I think he writes this in German. No, here is the German. And okay, one important point what Ugo Vlaisavljević says that in traditional culture, people is living together in little communal units. They don't have marketplaces. They have a kind of neighborhood connections, and from neighborhood connections where the identity of different religions even is reinforced. When I visit, when a Christian visits Muslim or vice versa, the identity reinforce each other, as you write. It is very interesting. So we cannot, in every aspect, build on the local culture or on the local civilization. And one last quotation. One of the most important political tasks of post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina is the task of inter-ethnic reconciliation. The basic values and norms of all three monotheistic religions could be a reliable support to efforts aimed at helping local ethnic communities to reach a consensus on the basic principle of their coexistence in a multi-ethnic and multi-professional society. Who could seriously claim that religion should be pulled out of the public forum at the moment when such an important role has been ascribed to it? And I think when we try to build a community for such different languages, cultures, religions, we have to start in the way that we look for the values which are common in all religions, the one God, the help to the other, and so on, and to build up on this. And yes, I think I quote some classicals, Kant and Rawls, with these formal principles, but as we have heard in the morning, the substance is difficult. The epistemological side of this rational structure is the difficult one. Act as if the maximum of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature, or there is another formulation, or Rawls, the principle of justice are chosen behind the veil of ignorance. If we try to take this principle seriously and build it into the political constitutions, we can, in a long discussion and conversation, reach a peaceful and just societal arrangement in this area, in Hungary and Central Europe,